But the next best available crude is from Canada that matches the configurations of these refineries and how they were built. And so to put anything in place that makes that more difficult, when you already have a 10% reduction in carbon intensity by 2020, this does nothing to take away from that. This is an extra added difficult policy on top of an already difficult policy, on top of a 10% reduction in our allocations last week policy. And then lastly, I don't know why the Energy Commission isn't here at the hearing, but we should probably engage them more on this. They are dealing with the Integrated Energy Policy Report on transportation fuels. They're working with the Air Resources Board on the scenarios that you heard Chairwoman Nichols talk about. We haven't seen the next version of those, but this version that they analyzed, this is the results they came up with, which says they're concerned. And so they're at least concerned, and so we should at least, I think, look at the implications of the low-carbon fuel standard on supply, availability, affordability. And again, I'm glad we have two periodic reviews built in. I hope this committee stays engaged on those. But lower carbon intensity biofuels are expected to command a price premium. This is all according to the Energy Commission. Over the long term, there will be pressure to pass those cost increases along to consumers. The potential impact on E10 prices for using Brazilian ethanol, as we told you, as we showed in the chart, is one we have to use to meet that next compliance obligation, could range between 10 cents per gallon and 17 cents per gallon. And then they're just, as you've heard, many speak to the challenges of adequate vehicle production, sales, refueling infrastructure, and technical standards. And just as an aside, I mean, we are working very closely. You'll hear speakers that are coming up talk about how we're trying to figure out how to bring hydrogen to market. And not through the Clean Fuels Regulation, which is a mandate being suggested by the Air Resources Board, but through a partnership of the Clean Fuels Partnership, the agencies, including Air Resources Board is at the table, Energy Commission and others. But what we're doing there is something creative. Senator Stisonia, you asked about funding. Here's a creative funding option. It's actually taking 118 money, we're suggesting, using that as a loan guarantee for people who own these stations, who are the marketers, the small marketers. They're not our members. We own less than 10% of gas stations in the state. Most of them are owned by independent marketers. Those marketers are interested in taking the risk of putting hydrogen at retail. They can't afford to do it, but if they had a loan guarantee that they could have a reasonable return on investment, they would do it. And so we're working on how to make that creative solution happen for hydrogen. Not necessarily because we make it, not necessarily because we have stations, but because we've been asked to be helpful and we think this is a decent way to do it. So it's a creative funding mechanism, which we really have to get creative on right now. And why would a CIOMA member, why would an independent marketer want hydrogen at their station? Because they're competing with the people who are going to look at residential plug-in electrics. And they need something at retail that they can compete with. So that's why they're interested in hydrogen. So we think it's a pretty good proposal, so we're going to see if we can help make that happen. And the 118 funds that was brought up, getting those reauthorized, they sunset in 2016. We'd love to see that program continue. It is the program that is making the right investments for electricity and hydrogen and these alternatives for infrastructure. And so we think it's hopefully something your committee or the legislature would look at in extending the 118 funds going forward to support these critical efforts. So thank you for having us, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And your question about the Energy Commission being here, we did this just as Transportation and Housing Committee because we wanted to try to keep it as narrow as possible, and you can see our success at that. So future discussions with Senator Padilla and the Energy Committee, perhaps we will have another informational hearing, as he did last year in Southern California around battery electric technology with this committee when Senator Lowenthal was the chair. So thank you, Catherine. That was great. We'll move to the next presenter, Denise.
Chairman DeSaulnier, Senator Rubio, and other members of the committee, if you're listening. I am Denise Gitsum, Director of Corporate Affairs and Legislative Counsel for Sapphire Energy, headquartered in San Diego. I'm testifying today on behalf of the Advanced Biofuels Association. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the role advanced biofuels will play in helping the state of California meet the goals of AB32. The Advanced Biofuels Association, commonly referred to as the ABFA, is a national trade association located in Washington, D.C., representing 39 of our nation's most promising advanced biofuels companies. Our membership spans a wide variety of platform technologies, from synthetic biology to biomass to fuels, to cellulosic biofuels, and to my personal favorite, and yours, algae-based drop-in fuels. A quarter of our membership consists of California-based companies, including Amyris, LS9, Solazyme, and Sapphire, to name a few. Consequently, California's policies regarding carbon intensity values and the low carbon fuel standard are important to our members, either because they're located in the state or because of California's significant influence on federal energy and environmental policies. AB32 has set bold and aggressive GHG emissions reduction targets for the transportation fuels industry, which we all strive to meet and exceed. The federal government and other states have looked to California for leadership in developing environmental and energy policies. AB32 strengthens California's legacy in this realm. However, the ABFA does have concerns regarding certain elements of AB32's implementation. Specifically, California's protracted technical discussions regarding modifications to life cycle carbon intensity values have introduced crippling uncertainty into our industry. This uncertainty limits the private investment we need in order to commercialize. Consequently, we urge you to establish mechanisms to stabilize the LCFS compliance market. Such an approach could involve, for example, establishing alternative compliance mechanisms that reward investments in qualified low-carbon advanced biofuel projects, or establishing provisions that protect a low-carbon fuel's carbon intensity score from the volatility of ever-evolving but important academic models. We also ask that all transportation fuel technologies, including advanced biofuels, be assessed similarly for their environmental impact. Currently, the LCFS only assigns indirect land use effects for biofuels. Additionally, CARB is assessing sustainability reporting criteria that would apply primarily to the biofuels industry. Neither of these elements have been meaningfully evaluated for their potential application to any other transportation fuels or technologies. Now on to the good news. The last 4 years have brought enormous momentum to the advanced biofuels industry. California companies are leading the way and creating jobs in the process. Amyris has grown from 30 employees in 2007 to over 400 today, while LS9 boasts 77, Solazyme has 150, and Sapphire has 155. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The San Diego Association of Governments economic analysis of algae-based fuel industry shows a doubling of economic activity in the region every year due directly to algae-based fuel production since 2009. In 2011, they've found that over 600 jobs have been created and over $200 million in economic activity has been generated. The numbers speak for themselves. The potential is great for California's economic growth resulting directly from the advanced biofuels industry. In addition to jobs, in the past year, 6 member companies have transitioned to be publicly traded. Additionally, 5 of our member companies have produced and successfully tested their alternative jet fuels in commercial flights. I'm particularly proud of the fact that in January 2009, Sapphire Energy became the world's first algae-based fuel company to successfully fly a commercial jet on a 50-50 biofuel blend. More recently, the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels flew in air shows on a 50-50 blend of renewable jet fuels made by UOP Honeywell. In spite of our significant accomplishments, ABFA companies still require commercial funding to move forward at an expeditious pace, which is challenging in this economic environment. Our industry, constantly manages 3 risks in its quest to commercialize: technology risk, commodity volatility, and regulatory volatility. While the state can do little to affect technology risk and commodity volatility, California can establish a stable policy framework that offers regulatory certainty to our industry and its potential investors. This, in turn, will help commercialize the growing California-based advanced biofuels industry for the benefit of our state, its economy, and our environment. If you'll allow me to just go off script for a moment, I just want to speak to a couple of issues that were raised earlier in the previous panel that I think are addressed by the deployment of algae-based fuels. First, and also because Chairman Desaulnier mentioned that he was interested in learning more about different technologies, this could be enlightening. First, there's been a lot of discussion about infrastructure challenges today. Fortunately, algae-based fuels are drop-in fuels. As such, there are no infrastructure challenges to using our fuels, which are refined in traditional refineries and include gas, diesel, and jet fuel that meet ASTM standards that are similar to their petroleum-based counterparts. This is why the U.S. Navy has expressed a serious interest in committing significant dollars to the development and deployment of drop-in fuels such as those made from algae-based algae. Second, Chairman Nichols expressed concern about diverting arable land and potable water to grow energy crops. Algae grows in salty or brackish water on non-arable land, rendering these issues moot. Third, algae-based drop-in fuels are low carbon. In fact, the California-based consulting firm, which CARB is very familiar with, Lifecycle Associates, determined that algae-based diesel represents an approximate 70% reduction in GHG emissions on a life cycle basis, a finding confirmed by the U.S. EPA in its RFS2 ruling. Finally, you should be proud of algae-based fuel technology. It's distinctly Californian in origin. San Diego is recognized globally as the hub of algae, thanks to UCSC, Scripps, and the many algae-based fuel companies located in La Jolla. That's as homegrown as it gets, and we should be proud of our leadership in this field. I'll conclude by thanking you for your leadership on these issues and offering the ABFA and Sapphire Energy as resources to you in the development of these important policies.
Thank you. I think we need a little marketing work on the California algae thing. Welcome. Eileen, nice to see you.
Thank you. My name is Eileen Tudd, and I am the Executive Director of the California Electric Transportation Coalition. I have a long history as a regulator, both at the California Air Resources Board and then at the California Environmental Protection Agency. So Chairman DeSaulnier, members that may be listening, members of the staff, and former members of DeSaulnier's staff, thank you for this opportunity to be here today and testify in this important hearing. CalETC is an organization that's been committed to transforming the transportation sector to electricity for almost 20 years now. We believe that electricity in the transportation sector offers a locally produced, economically viable, and sustainable option for the transportation fuels market. The policy leadership shown by the state of California, the legislature, the administration, and the good work of the state agencies, including the Energy Commission and the PUC, I hope we do have a combined trans and energy hearing at some point in the future. These are the key drivers in attracting a new generation of electric vehicles to this state. That's why all the automakers are focusing on California first, because of the policies in the state in large part. AB32 and the low carbon fuel standard are prime examples of this kind of leadership. Now, California's utilities will be providing the bulk of the electricity for these vehicles, and they are very, very committed to supplying this fuel. They work with the local governments, they work with the auto industry, they work with members of the legislature and other policymakers. They're very, very active in this and engaged and want this vehicle technology to succeed, and they want to provide clean energy to those vehicles. In California, we have policies to ensure that the electricity we use comes from clean resources, natural gas and renewable resources that either eliminate or significantly reduce harmful emissions and greenhouse gases. Now, there are some unique beneficial aspects to electricity as a transportation fuel, and in honor of the title of this hearing, I would like to present some thoughts about what future electric vehicles offer from a fuels perspective. So on a per-mile basis, electricity costs about 1/4 what gasoline costs. So for every mile you drive on electricity rather than gasoline, a customer saves about 75% on fuel costs. A vehicle operating on electricity gets cleaner as it gets older. Not at all the case with gasoline vehicles, and the reason is that we are moving towards a more renewable electricity sector. Electricity is a locally produced fuel, much like algae. But produced all over the state. Electric vehicles can be plugged in at home or at work, and electricity is ubiquitous in our homes, our businesses, our communities, and that minimizes the costs of infrastructure associated with this fuel. The costs of this infrastructure are coming down quickly, and the market availability of options for this infrastructure is growing rapidly. And every vehicle offered today, and I would posit that every vehicle offered in the future, will be able to just plug into your regular 120 wall socket. Many customers are choosing this option, and that means there's no infrastructure costs. The California utilities are very closely tied to their local governments and their communities, and in some cases in the public utilities world, they are local government. Everybody who buys electricity benefits from the proliferation of electric vehicles in the market. These vehicles enable a safe, reliable, efficient integration of the load that the vehicles demand and the grid. An electric car can communicate with the grid. It can assure every customer a full battery by a specific time, charging only when the cost of electricity and the impacts of that electricity are at their minimal point. That would be like if you took your gasoline car home, you parked it in a garage or in your carport or wherever you park it. It left in the middle of the night while you were asleep, searched around town and all around the neighboring communities, found the cheapest gasoline, filled itself up, and then got back in time for you to go wherever you needed to go the next day. That's the kind of opportunity that an electric vehicle can offer. It's very, very different kind of utility for customers than a gasoline vehicle. So I'm going to wrap up my short testimony. I tried to keep it in 5 minutes. I took you to heart by reiterating CalETC support for both AB32 and the low carbon fuel standard regulations. In the transportation fuels world, the low carbon fuel standard is essential to support low carbon fuels like electricity and, in fact, the market for these vehicles. There is a built-in incentive into the low carbon fuel standard for low carbon fuels, and we don't want to lose that incentive. However, we want to remain realistic. Oil holds a 95% market share advantage over every other transportation fuel. The fuel that has broken into the mainstream with the most success is corn ethanol because you can just blend it into gasoline. The Air Board has demonstrated that corn ethanol alone is not going to help us meet the policy goals of this state. We have to break our near total dependence on oil in the transportation sector. Electric vehicles are the gateway vehicle, if you will. They promise a future of diverse transportation fuel sources and the economic stability that results from true petroleum independence. The low-carbon fuel standard regulation provides the needed value in the transportation fuels market. It does contain a market component, as the chairman said earlier, and this encourages fuel switching from gasoline to electricity. Utilities are ready and willing to help serve and provide value to the people who buy these vehicles. And they can help enable the LCFS policy goals to ensure they're met. California has the right policies in place, but transitioning towards a diverse, low-carbon fuels future will require much more than just the right policies. We all need to recognize that we are a state dependent on a single fuel, and getting off that fuel means that everyone who's looking at a new car or a used car when these cars get into the used car market will hopefully consider an electric vehicle or another alternative fuel vehicle option. Thank you very much for your time and consideration this afternoon.
Thanks, Celine. Now I know Catherine, our next speaker, needs to use the PowerPoint, so if we could switch up but keep you around for questions. Tim, coming from a mom and pop organization, doesn't have a PowerPoint. Is that right? Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Senator DeSaulnier, for the opportunity to participate today in the hearing. And I'll be talking about the California Fuel Cell Partnership and our members' work to build market foundations for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles here in California. So I got to show you the chart here. Like other fuels and vehicles that you're hearing about today, fuel cell vehicles do reduce greenhouse gases and pollutants when compared to conventional gasoline vehicles. Today, most of the hydrogen that we use for a variety of different industrial application comes from natural gas. And when you use that hydrogen made from natural gas in a fuel cell vehicle, you reduce energy, you reduce greenhouse gases by over 50%, and of course reduce criteria pollutants as well. This data comes from the Energy Commission's analysis back from August of 2007. It's also confirmed more recently by a Department of Energy record in which they looked at petroleum utilization and greenhouse gases compared to a projected 2035 model year vehicle. So also came up with the about 55% reduction when the hydrogen comes from natural gas. When hydrogen comes from renewable sources, of course, it reduces greenhouse gases even further, up to nearly 100%. So it's one thing to see this in a chart. It's another thing to see it in action. For example, Honda's been leasing its FCX Clarity to customers for more than a year. I think some of you, perhaps have had an opportunity to drive the car. Honda's president and CEO said that we continue to believe that a fuel cell electric vehicle is the ultimate solution to reduce greenhouse CO2 emissions. A fuel cell car is a full electric vehicle. That's one of the things that I think we find the greatest misconception is that these are part of the family of electric drive vehicles along with the plug-in vehicles and the plug-in hybrids. Mercedes has just started leasing their new B-Class to customers in California and in Germany. As a show of durability and range, they drove 3 of the cars around the world, literally around the world. Mercedes said that the entire 20,000-mile journey was the carbon equivalent of about 3.5 minutes in German traffic. AC Transit has demonstrated greenhouse gas reductions with its first-generation bus using hydrogen made by natural gas on site at a station located in Oakland. And they found that their first-generation bus reduced greenhouse gases by 43% using hydrogen from natural gas. Now they're deploying a fleet of 12 third-generation buses using hydrogen made from both renewable and conventional sources. Fuel cell vehicles are coming. We survey our automaker members every year, and they've consistently reported that by 2017, they'll have more than 50,000 passenger fuel cell vehicles on California roads. Now, hydrogen stations must be available in advance of the vehicles so that customers have the confidence they can get fuel when and where they need it. We just, Chairman Nichols mentioned in her testimony that Nissan has just released its 6-year green policy, and they have announced that by 2016 they will introduce a fuel cell vehicle to the market. So my organization, the California Fuel Cell Partnership, works with our members, including automakers, to identify the priority early market communities where stations are needed first. We have 6 stations that are currently open to the public. 4 more are poised to open in the coming months, and 11 new or upgraded stations are announced for funding. That's through the AB118 program that was announced last year. So this is all really good. We're making great progress. We're on track to have about 20 stations in Southern and Northern California by early 2013. And these stations will provide the foundation for market growth. We need to expand the number of stations as vehicle sales ramp up. Today, we're kind of in a similar place to where we were when horseless carriages were first widely introduced about 100 years ago. At that time, filling stations were small, and people needed to plan ahead, plan their travel, and know where they were going to be able to get fuel. Businesses took risks at that time to introduce a new fuel, gasoline, to a small but growing group of customers. Growing the hydrogen fuel market will require a partnership between government and industry. Hydrogen suppliers, and these are our members here on the left, they're the industrial gas companies. They're investing to reduce station equipment costs, reduce station size, develop new sources of hydrogen from renewable and waste feedstocks. And we've been very fortunate to have government incentives through AB118 as an example to help build that customer confidence to assure the fuel cell vehicle drivers that hydrogen will be available in their community. The incentives also, very importantly, help the fuel retailers, who most of whom are small businesses, during this early period when vehicle volumes and therefore fuel sales are still growing. California's work to build markets for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles is part of a global endeavor to reduce petroleum dependency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve air quality while offering vehicles that meet customer needs and spur innovation. Together with Germany, Japan, Korea, China, and other U.S. states such as New York and Hawaii, We are sharing learnings, growing the business, and building new solutions that will advance hydrogen fuel for transportation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Tim, you're last
of this panel.
Yeah.
Senator Saulnier and Senator Keogh, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I believe I was recruited to give the good news story. I represent the California Natural Gas Vehicle Coalition, about 30 companies operating here in California that sell the fuel, sell the vehicles, or use the vehicles running on natural gas and want to see natural gas advance as a transportation fuel. I've provided about 3 pages of comments. I'm not going to read them all or touch on them all. I'm just going to give you a few highlights. But really, there's a lot of important information here. Not only, I think a lot of it that has not yet been addressed in this hearing. Natural gas is a clean, low-carbon, low-cost fuel that is abundant in North America. I believe it can be part of the solution for the LCFS as well as longer-term environmental goals for the state. Especially if you factor in the growth in renewable natural gas, whether it's blended or used on its own, there's great potential for very, very low carbon fuel in the natural gas arena. A lot of people don't realize that Honda's natural gas Civic has now been identified 8 years in a row as the cleanest car in America. There's a lot of buzz about EVs and hybrids and fuel cells, but for the last 8 years, the cleanest car in America was the Honda Civic natural gas. That said, I think the greatest potential for growth for natural gas as transportation fuel is in the heavy-duty sector, primarily because of the cost differential with diesel and because of lack of alternatives. There just aren't as many alternatives in the heavy-duty sector as there are in the light-duty sector. And I think the cost today and the anticipated increased cost of diesel in the future will be the primary driver for increased use of natural gas in the heavy-duty sector. The industry that I represent is targeting 150,000 heavy-duty trucks over the next 5 years. That would displace 2 billion gallons a year in petroleum. So why am I talking so much about heavy-duty when everyone else has been talking about light-duty? If you noticed, one of Dr. Manley's slides, one of the pie charts showed that heavy-duty vehicles are only 4% of the fleet, but they consume 22% of the fuel. And that is a very important stat to keep in mind as you're thinking about where are we going with clean fuels, whether your goal is clean air or GHG reductions or energy security. 4% of the vehicles on the road, the heavy-duty trucks, are consuming 22% of the fuel used in this country today. So all of the fuels that you're hearing about today have their benefits and have their challenges, including natural gas. On the benefit side, we're at least 20% cleaner carbon than petroleum fuels. If you're looking at renewable natural gas, we're 90% better. On the cost side, natural gas on an energy equivalent basis is typically a dollar or two less per gallon than the petroleum products. And you can now home refuel with natural gas, and there's an abundant supply here in North America. On the challenge side, the 2 concerns that I hear the most about, or most frequently hear, are the cost of the vehicle. And for a light-duty vehicle, you're looking at about a $6,000 premium for natural gas. And on heavy-duty, it's probably about $50,000, depending on the model and the quantities produced. Those prices are going to come down as more vehicles are produced. In the highly competitive refuse sector, that differential is already down to $10,000 a vehicle. So why are companies going out? If it costs more to buy these vehicles, why are companies going out and buying natural gas vehicles today in the thousands? AT&T, Verizon, UPS, Waste Management. It's because the cost of the fuel is so much less than diesel or gasoline that they can get their money back, given the number of miles they drive those vehicles, in a very short period of time, 2 or 3 years. The other issue you hear a lot about is lack of infrastructure. We have just about 450 natural gas stations in California, private and public. Compare that to about 10,000 gasoline and diesel stations. Still a small fraction, but that number is growing. And if you look at the sheet I have, I'm not going to get into the details, there were big private investments in natural gas infrastructure this summer. hundreds of millions of dollars invested or committed that's going to radically change the rollout of the speed at which natural gas infrastructure rolls out for transportation. The last thing I want to mention on the challenge side is something that I imagine you've heard a little bit about: hydraulic fracturing, sometimes known as fracking. This is an extraction method for getting natural gas out of the ground. A couple of comments on this. One, today it represents about 15% of the production of natural gas, but it's projected to grow to 50%. Two, EPA just last week announced their plan for how they're going to develop and implement stricter environmental controls on this process. And three, there was a bill run this summer in the California Assembly that addressed this issue, and specifically disclosure of chemicals used and public notification, and our member companies supported that legislation. Finally, on California policy, and I think really that's where we want to go with any discussion we have with the Senate, is what can you do to help? And there are four things I want to, actually five, because of Senator Rubio's comments. I want to highlight five things real briefly. One, moving beyond the LCFS. A lot of people today are talking about how we're going to meet the LCFS. Our industry is thinking beyond the LCFS. LCFS is only 10% reduction. That's not enough. It's a step. It's important. But what are we doing to get beyond that? And I highlight Assembly Bill 1007. Ms. Pavley's no longer here, but a bill she authored 5 or 6 years ago that led the state to develop an alternative fuels plan. That was a good plan that set a good target. That target should be codified. Ms. Skinner introduced legislation this year to do that. We're hoping with the Senate support in the new year, we'll see that become law. Pipeline access for renewable natural gas. This is a hot issue. It's going to be on your radar screens if it isn't already. Utilities, some of the utilities have been very concerned about putting renewable natural gas into the pipeline, and that would somehow create some sort of contamination problems for their fossil fuel natural gas. We don't believe that's the case. There's a very important study coming out in December that we think will allay many of the utilities' concerns, but we will still need legislation to remove some of the obstacles that exist today to putting renewable natural gas into the pipeline, and we need to do that. The Air Resources Board can do a lot more to support natural gas as a transportation fuel. For all the good work that the Air Board has done relative to light-duty vehicles and developing various technologies, they have done very little in the heavy-duty sector beyond diesel traps and strategies to clean up diesel. There is a real need to have a coordinated heavy-duty action plan for the state of California, and the Air Board has a very important role in that, in developing that and implementing that. There's a lot that can be done with the existing monies to invest more in alternative fuels in the heavy-duty sector going in the near term. The state fleet, I think Senator Saulnier, Senator Liu, among others, have paid attention to this issue. The state fleet has the potential to be a global leader on clean fuels, and we are not there yet. I am actually hopeful. If you'd asked me in the spring, I wouldn't have said that. But this fall, I'm hopeful because there's new leadership at the Department of General Services, and they are much more open-minded and positive about alternative fuels than anybody that was there in the last 10 years. So that is very positive. We're working with Ms. Butler on legislation and with DGS to develop an action plan for the state fleet. Obviously, we're not buying vehicles right now because of the budget, but we want good policy in place for when we start buying vehicles again. Finally, because of Senator Rubio's questioning about AB 118 and funding, first of all, the question should be broader than AB 118 because it's an important program, but it's not the only funding program in place. We still have a 1B bond funding. We still have the Carl Moyer program, and then, of course, AB 118. These programs are all going to sunset in the next 5 years. And it's very important for Senator Rubio and others on this committee to be thinking about, are we getting the most for those dollars? What programs do we want to renew? And how are we going to fund them if we decide we want to renew them? I am a fan of what's being done with the AB 118 funds. I think the $100 million that is being doled out by the Energy Commission each year is being well invested and is doing a lot to advance this clean fuels, clean technology sector in the near term. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay. Senator Keogh, you have any questions? You missed a fine presentation and an admonishment that we should be more proud of San Diego algae. So.
Oh, well, very good. San Diego is an algae R&D center, so we're aware of that, and we've seen some really fantastic demonstrations down there. I guess to Mr. Carmichael, I guess I thought I think of clean natural gas as sort of older technology. You know, some of the buses downtown and some of the public fleets, heavy duty trucks, garbage trucks, and street sweepers and things like that. But you're talking about it as though it's continues to be an important part of the menu of fuels we can use for reduction. So how big a portion of the pie chart is it? Not just heavy duty, but clean natural gas. What is it as far as a fuel?
Okay, thank you for the question. Transit is one sector where natural gas has made a major impact. In California, almost all of the transit agencies are now running majority, if not 100%, natural gas in transit buses. In the refuse fleets, they're on the same trajectory to be running a majority, or close to 100%. Waste Management announced this year that they intend to be 80% alternative fuels in their purchasing going forward, period. I think majority of that will be natural gas, but some chunk will be hybrid as well. You're also seeing fleets like AT&T and Verizon with the service vans going natural gas in a big way, again, because of the price of the fuel and how much they can save. Natural gas has been around for 20 years, at least familiar to us for 20 years, at least in the transit applications. But the engines are newer and better. And there's the potential to go beyond fossil fuel natural gas, which is what we've been exposed to historically, and blend in a renewable natural gas. And if you look at the Air Resources Board analysis of clean fuels, either the cleanest or the second cleanest fuel in their carbon intensity tables relative to greenhouse gases is renewable natural gas. So you can, and renewable natural gas, for those that aren't as familiar with it, can come from a landfill. It can come from a wastewater treatment plant. It can come from a dairy. It can come from almost any waste stream.
Methane. Sure.
Yes. And so there's a lot.
But as far as consumer vehicles go, regular, private citizens. You mentioned the Civic, but I mean that's a pretty small fraction of the market.
It is. It is, and I share your frustration in that today in Europe you can buy 50-plus different light-duty models running on natural gas. The number is not quite that big, but in the dozens if you're in Southeast Asia. In California, you can buy one or two. The Ford Transit Connect will soon be on the market and available. It's probably going to go primarily to fleets, but some individuals will also be going for that model. But the U.S. and the foreign manufacturers aren't bringing as many natural gas light-duty models to the California market. I think at least in part because there's so much in the mix in the light-duty sector. As I was referring to ARB's active work in this area a moment ago. Electric vehicles. Right. Cleaner, hybrid.
I think it's one of our challenges with the plug-in electric vehicle collaboration. We've got the old-time hybrids, like the ones down the basement, gas, electric. We've got the plug-ins hybrids. We've got all electric, and then in the out years, the fuel cell, which I don't know. I still think is more in the future, but I'm not an early adapter, so it could be me. But I mean, there are so many things in the mix. We want to be technology neutral, let the best designs and the most marketable or appealing technologies win out, at least with the general consumer market. But I think consumers are hesitating because they don't know what to pick. They don't know what is going to work out for them. Whether it's the range anxiety or, am I going to be driving around with the canister in the back the same as the backyard barbecue? Or I don't know if they always know what's going on.
So,
I'd like to hear electric vehicle folks respond to that too. But go ahead, Tim.
Real quickly, I think this decade is going to be a shakeout decade. I think it's very important for the state of California to continue its portfolio approach to supporting these various fuels and technologies, because we really don't know yet what's going to stick and what's going to deliver. And it may be that something that is not on our radar screens yet is going to come to the fore this decade. But a lot, I think, is going to be learned this decade. And we're going to make a lot of progress, and we're going to make some mistakes. And that's okay, because we're really about changing the world and the way that we have been moving ourselves and moving our goods around our state.
Thanks, Jim. And yeah.
Well, I just want to say that I don't like the term shakeout, because I think that makes it sound like there's going to be one technology, and I just don't believe that. I think there's going to be a mix of vehicle technologies. And what we're finding in this very early market from an electric vehicle standpoint, from a plug-in electric vehicle standpoint, is that one, even though people start out a little bit nervous about the range, that within about 2 weeks that goes away, and there's a lot of education and outreach that needs to happen to help that be overcome. I would also say that what they recognize is that the utility that the vehicle offers is so much different, and in many cases much more to their liking than a gasoline vehicle. As you know, I've driven one for 10 years. I've gone to get my vehicle serviced twice. Twice in 10 years I've taken my car in to be serviced, other than things like new tires. I've 2 times in 10 years. No oil changes, no nothing. That's something that I really appreciate. I have never had to take it to a gas station. I mean, I just plug in when I get home or when I'm at work. Those kinds of advantages are going to be very valuable to customers who try these vehicles, and they're really going to like them. And those are just the beginning. I mean, I talked a little bit about some of the other advantages in my talk, and we can check in later. But I want to say that I think that what I look forward to in the future is not a one vehicle. I think petroleum has a place. I think fuel cell vehicles definitely have a place, natural gas vehicles, and electric drive certainly, and not just in the light-duty vehicle sector, but also in the heavy-duty vehicle sector. I think we're going to see some big transitions in the entirety of the transportation sector.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Keogh. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Like with the previous panel, I think I have a million questions, but given that we've slowly fallen behind, would like to continue the conversation. It would be a wonderful thing, and this is the Transportation Committee, so we have so many challenges providing infrastructure in the very near term, given the economy and our financing model for infrastructure. All of you, in various ways, depend on us providing that infrastructure for your product to work in the marketplace. So it would be wonderful for me to somehow, and for this committee, I think, get a real apples to the degree that's possible of how we provide that infrastructure and what we get in return, a cost benefit. And maybe that's something we have to pursue with people like the Energy Department at UC Berkeley. But having said all that, Catherine, you are the fuel provider of the present by far and away, your constituent group. And when I say that I hope that this committee looks at it sort of agnostically as it comes to fuel, it's always been my hope, and we've had this conversation individually, and I know I've had with some of your members, is that you continue to participate in this, as you acknowledged when you talked, because you're all in a very competitive marketplace, and all of you have competition within your constituent groups. So the proper relationship for this committee with all of you is really sort of what I'm searching for as I start my first full year as chair, and I'd love to have a discussion on how we do that. And then secondarily is I'm an eternal optimist, and whether you call it a shakeout or not, having been at this for a while, having sat in meetings around the ZEV mandate, I don't know how many Tim and I, you and I went through, and Catherine, where fuel cells were right around the corner, with all due respect, Catherine, to being mass produced. And it was our hope, and I know you continue to hope that, where battery electric was right around the corner. And certainly there have been all of that research and all that effort and investment have showed benefit to us, not as we anticipated, and the gold standard that we used to talk about. But all of these things, as we get through this next shakeout, or whatever we call it, decade or the next few years, how the legislature interacts with all of you to make you successful, really. And It's so important to us, not just around our climate change goals, but I really think of the success of our economy, having been and still being a small business owner. The one thing that, and from what the economic studies have shown us, when this country starts to go into recession, it's almost one of the first triggers is the cost of fuel, because it affects everyone. It affects every consumer individually, and it affects every business. So how we interact with you, I'd like to have more of a discussion and perhaps come back and then have a discussion with Senator Padilla, and it's nice that Senator Pavley, Senator Rubio, and I are all on that committee, and Senator Keogh, of course, is the former chair of that committee. But as we leave here today, I'd like to have a continued discussion about how the committee and the committees can interact with you and anticipate some of the changes that and the challenges you all have with these changes. So thank you for being here, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That will bring us to our last panel, Impacts of the Fuels of the Future, and we'll ask we actually have 6 people who are going to testify, so we'll ask the first 5 to come forward and then ask Mr. Epstein to stand by and come up. 4? Okay.
3. Yeah, just these 3. The first 3 on the panel.
I will defer to the sergeants. And we're going to start with the National Resource Defense Council and just go right through the agenda. So it's all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Chairman Desalegn and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Simon Mui, and I'm a scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council working on clean vehicles and fuels. As you probably know, NRDC is a nonprofit organization with more than 1.3 million members and online activists, 250,000 of whom are Californians. California's low carbon fuel standard is one of the state's key strategies for meeting our AB32 carbon pollution reduction targets and protecting our economy from high and volatile oil prices. California's transportation system, as you've heard earlier today, is over 95% dependent on petroleum. Here you see the graph, kind of the breakdown here, and I think the previous comments from Catherine are right, that if we continue down a business as usual course, this fraction will remain the same going forward. This year, California families and businesses will spend an estimated $65 billion at the pump, and will send an estimated $41 billion outside our state to import crude oil and other petroleum products. We're hoping the LCFS standard can change that equation. The low-carbon fuel standard requires the oil industry to help diversify our fuel supply by replacing petroleum with cleaner fuels like advanced biofuels, electricity, natural gas, hydrogen. Many of these fuels will be domestically produced, meaning less money sent abroad. As a performance-based standard, the LCFS leaves it up entirely to the oil industry to choose which fuels and how much, as long as they reduce the carbon emissions from the fuel pool by 10% by 2020. The LCFS holds all fuel providers equal and to the same standard and bar, whether they're domestic providers or importers of fuel products. By 2020, the LCFS will cut our oil dependency by 15% and cut 23 million metric tons of carbon pollution. What's important, though, is that we have a clear and consistent and certain investment signal from the LCFS. That's key to ensuring that oil companies increase their investments and commitment to lower carbon fuels. And so I think the earlier speaker from WISPA, Catherine, had shown a graph, and this is a different cut at the graph. It's basically from the International Energy Agency. And what it shows is that despite the tremendous growth in biofuel investments over the past decade, this is a total oil company investments in lower carbon alternative fuels remain dwarfed by their traditional investments in oil production. This figure from the International Energy Agency estimates that globally oil companies' capital investments averaged $340 billion annually on oil exploration and production from 2004 to 2009. This compares with $10 billion spent annually on capital investments for biofuels globally, with less than about $2 billion annually coming from oil companies. So perhaps not surprisingly, this vast disparity in investments demonstrates that we do need good policy to diversify our fuel supply, bring in lower carbon fuels, and to break our dependency on oil. The LCFS is critical to providing choice and competition in the transportation fuels market. The LCFS, by creating regulatory certainty, incentivizes new businesses and private capital markets to invest in commercializing clean alternative fuels. Any weakening of support for the standards undermines private capital investments in clean fuels, a fact to which the oil companies and clean fuel providers are well aware. What is needed is really continued long-term regulatory certainty for the low-carbon fuel standard. Low-carbon fuel standards, suppliers and investors really need to know that their investments today will be rewarded tomorrow and afterwards. As I show next in this chart, the LCFS requirements are eminently achievable. This is a slide showing potential reduction opportunities by 2015. Going from today's levels to 2015 and then 2020 can be accomplished by strategies such as switching to greater use of advanced biofuels, improving the carbon footprint of our current conventional biofuels, and utilizing electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen going forward. I'd just like to point out that the previous graph showing the compliance schedule that WISPA showed really shows effectively the second generation ethanol here and cleaner corn and sugarcane ethanol. So really the purple and the green bar here. I would just argue that the industry really does need to look under every rock for potential opportunities. There's a lot more out there in terms of compliance and reduction opportunities for the low carbon fuel standard. In terms of the high carbon intensity crude oil provision, I would just say that ARB has worked very hard over the past year and a half to address a lot of the industry concerns, and they've changed their provision to reflect some of the concerns being raised. But what I would say now is that oil companies are not penalized so long as they don't get any worse in terms of emissions from gasoline and diesel. And that's a very fair approach, considering that all other alternative fuels are held to the standard that they get the carbon score that they get. And any worsening over time in terms of gasoline and diesel should be captured by any life cycle approach as well. I would also just mention that there are now opportunities to generate credits, not shown here, from improvements upstream in terms of investments made by oil companies to clean up upstream production. So I'll give an example. Chevron is in a project with Bright Source Solar to provide solar thermal to heat up enhanced oil recovery in Coalinga, California. That could possibly be credited now under the low carbon fuel standard, bringing more credits to the table, more reduction opportunities. I'll just close that this really isn't rocket science or some future far-off field. It is about leadership, though, and commitment to investing and scaling up what we already have and know how to do. So, Chairman Desalegn and members of the committee, I will say that diversifying our fuel supply with clean, domestically produced alternative fuels is really critical to meeting our state environmental and health goals. It's also critical to protecting consumer pocketbooks and jobs against high and volatile oil prices. It's clear the technology exists to meet the LCFS requirements. Instead of sending our money out of the country to import oil and petroleum products, we can invest our money in creating a new clean fuels industry and jobs in the U.S. California, with its high-tech expertise and investment resources, is poised to lead this new industry, as you've heard from many speakers today, but it needs policymakers to remain firmly behind its groundbreaking LCFS standard. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. On.
afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Don Anair. I'm a vehicles engineer with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Climate change is the most serious long-term environmental threat facing our state, our nation, and the entire world. And as a Californian, I'm proud that our lawmakers, regulators, and citizens have voted time and again to back efforts to take this problem head on. And we really must not hesitate to do so when it comes to addressing our transportation fuels market. Climate science tells us that we must cut global warming pollution at least 80% to help avoid the worst consequences of global warming. And the economics really tells us that in the light-duty sector, we must reduce our emissions there by 90% or more. So when we're looking at our national transportation and climate landscape out to 2050, our future becomes clear. And you've seen some of these charts throughout the presentations today. But I think the first thing that's really important to recognize is that California has been a leader on clean vehicles for decades. And just recently, greenhouse gas standards for vehicles are going national, and we expect that by 2050, those standards can help reduce our emissions from the light-duty transportation sector about 50%. But really, to make the next step is much more challenging. It means looking at fuels, and it means making cars that don't run on oil. And with California continued leadership, we think we can achieve the goals that are before us. And this is going to mean a mix of sustainable biofuels as well as lower carbon hydrogen and electricity options. First, by 2040, 3 out of every 4 vehicles will need to be zero emission, powered by clean, low carbon hydrogen electricity. And so setting that stage means that we really need to focus on, by 2020, having these solutions ready to go. And the zero emission vehicle technology mandate is a critical piece to that on the vehicle technology side. And UCS supports reaching a 1.8 million number of vehicles of plug-in battery electric and fuel cell vehicles by 2025. But secondly, we need to maintain and expand a strong low-carbon fuel standard, which actually gets easier and easier to meet as we implement these other requirements. Federal and California standards for vehicles will reduce overall oil consumption, which makes it easier to meet the low-carbon fuel standard. And the increase in electricity and hydrogen that will be needed to fuel these vehicles under the zero emission vehicle mandate it also makes it much easier for the oil industry to meet the requirements in the LCFS. But really, the oil companies have to step up and do their share. With a market of over 95% of the oil market based on petroleum fuels, they have to be part of the solution. And that means investing in lower carbon fuels. It also means ensuring that consumers who are driving these advanced technology vehicles have access to the fuel. So investing in infrastructure to provide fuel outlets of hydrogen and electricity and other low carbon fuels is essential. And finally, as demand for electricity and hydrogen increases, the RPS and renewable hydrogen requirements must continue to evolve over the coming years to make sure that we aren't just trading emissions from our tailpipes and moving them upstream to the power plants and the refineries. So in addition to the technical progress, of course, also reducing vehicle mile travels and getting Californians to drive less is a key strategy. And I fell into the trap that Professor Kamen mentioned, that at the end of my presentation I start talking about vehicle miles traveled. But it is a critical piece, and it's built into our assumptions in this chart into the different pieces. I didn't pull it out separately. So I think, just to conclude my remarks, that California has been a leader on clean vehicles technology. It's been good for our economy. Everything, these policies for zero-emission vehicles, for renewable energy, they all point to investments in California that are going to create jobs. And I think California must continue its leadership, and it will be good for California's economy as well as achieving our climate goals. Thank you.
Bonnie? Sure. You want me to start it?
Thank you.
One moment. Okay. Thank you, Simon. Okay, good afternoon, Senator DeSaulnier and members who may be listening. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today and provide you with the public health perspective on the fuels of the future. And I'm really pleased to be here. Sorry for the lateness of the hour. I'll try to move through my testimony fairly quickly. And I want you to know, first of all, that the American Lung Association in California and our National American Lung Association office has been a very active participant in this whole area of clean fuel and vehicle policies because they are so critical to the state's ability and to our national ability to meet health-based clean air standards and, of course, our state's global warming strategy. Clearly, California has a very serious air pollution problem. I'm not going to go into all the details, but this movement toward diversifying our transportation fuels and dramatically increasing the use of the ultra-low carbon fuels is a clear necessity for California and the world. And I wanted to reemphasize the point that Mary Nichols made, that by 2050 we have to have a major shift in our transportation sector with over 80% of transportation fuels from ultra-low carbon sources, and that leads us to the actions we're taking today. California standards have already been responsible for hundreds of thousands of hybrid cars on the road, and we must continue to move forward at this same pace and even accelerate our pace toward increasing new and ultra-clean technologies on the road. And I wanted to note that the health community has been a key partner in pushing for strong regulations at the state level, both in the legislature, at the State Air Board, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the Clean Cars regulations, SB375. All of these policies we've mentioned have been supported by the public health community because of their key role in reducing health-damaging pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. I wanted to mention just briefly that the data, the information that we have on the health challenges from our vehicle dependents continues to grow. And we know that air pollution poses a daily challenge for millions of Californians living with asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, and other respiratory conditions. And that's why the American Lung Association has been so engaged in this effort. So at the American Lung Association, we spent some time and effort to try to quantify the true cost of driving from a health and environmental perspective. And we know that the true costs are enormous, but we contracted for research to help quantify those impacts. And in our Road to Clean Air study, we were able to compare the emissions, the public health, and the greenhouse gas benefits of converting California's entire fleet of cars from vehicles that meet our current vehicle and tailpipe standards to cars that achieve the next generation of standards, and we'll call those the advanced clean car scenario. And this way we could compare our status quo without any stronger action by California to a pathway that accelerates our cleaner technologies. So first of all, we have to recognize that our current fleet of cars consumes over 12 billion gallons of gasoline per year. And if you take this down to an individual car, if you look at this slide, we found that for every fill-up, so our cars are consuming over 12 billion gallons of gasoline per year. This causes $14.5 billion in health and other societal damages. So if we take this down to an individual car, we found that for every fill-up at the gas station, we're essentially paying a premium of about $20 in health, environmental, and societal costs. And these, of course, are numbers that don't show up at the pump, but we're paying them. And these are conservative numbers because they don't take into account the full costs of our petroleum dependence, for example, all the military and the security costs beyond the price disruptions that are caused by our dependence on gasoline. So we also looked at many other impacts, of course, from our dependence on petroleum fuels. Our consumption of over 12 billion gallons of gasoline per year, of course, leads to tremendous increase in premature deaths and asthma attacks. We found that California can avoid over $7 billion per year in health and global warming costs and reduce all major pollution-related impacts by moving by 70% by converting our fleet to more efficient vehicles and ramping up our production of plug-ins and battery electric cars. So when we went to quantify some specific reductions in illness and death based on our reductions in tons of air pollutants, we showed reduction of at least 400 premature deaths every year. You can see that in the slide here. We saw a reduction of 420 respiratory and emergency room visits, reductions in heart attacks, reductions in asthma attacks and lower respiratory symptoms, and a reduction of 180,000 cases of upper respiratory symptoms. So all this to say we can quantify this tremendous impact and the benefits that we can achieve by moving to cleaner transportation systems and cleaner fuels. Okay, a key aspect of moving toward, okay, in these slides I'm just going back through again the tremendous benefits in terms of reducing criteria pollutants by moving to the advanced clean car scenario. Here we see a reduction in over 189 tons per day in criteria air pollutant emissions, and also a reduction in 122,000 tons per day of greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to just move into one other key area. Zero-emission vehicles, including battery and fuel cells, are key, absolutely key to maximizing our air quality and health benefits. From a health perspective, we must maintain a strong focus on zero-emission vehicles and fuels. Our zero-emission vehicle program has been a key driver in the push toward cleaner transportation, and we have to protect that as we move forward. And also, the low-carbon fuel standard will be a key driver as supplies of renewable electric and hydrogen fuels become a key compliance strategy under the low-carbon fuel standard. So we believe that renewable electric and hydrogen fuels are a key part of our strategy for the future. So as we move forward, we're advocating a number of key state policies to move California forward toward a clean fuel future. There's a couple of key policy areas mentioned here. There's several others that have come up today. We want to, of course, see strong advanced clean car standards, and you know that the State Air Board is going to be moving forward in January to adopt a strong suite of clean car standards, including criteria pollutant and greenhouse gas controls. And we have some specific recommendations for adopting the strongest possible clean car standards. We also, as part of that, support phasing in a requirement that 20% of new car sales be battery electrics, plug-in electrics, or fuel cell vehicles or similar ultra-low carbon vehicles by 2025. This would result in almost 2 million zero-emission and plug-in hybrids on the road in 2025. Maintaining a strong low-carbon fuel standard is also very important. You've heard a lot of discussion today about the low-carbon fuel standard, and we maintain that the LCFS is a key compliance strategy for cleaner fuels and improving air quality and public health. But we must account for the full cost of our petroleum fuels, and so we must stick with the requirements in the LCFS for full life cycle accounting for petroleum fuels, especially high-carbon fuels. We've talked about reducing VMT, so I want to add my voice to others saying that reducing driving through sustainable communities is critically important. There's a number of key decisions coming up over this next year, over 2012, to adopt sustainable community strategies in different parts of the state. San Diego was mentioned, also Sacramento, the Bay Area, and Southern California. Very important decisions that are coming up, and we need to support those decisions to make sure we have strong, sustainable community plans. Also, the AB 118 funds were mentioned, and we completely agree about the importance of moving forward and reauthorizing those funds. So that's my quick run-through of key strategies and health impacts from the Lung Association's perspective, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, all three. If we could make room for the next three presenters, that would be terrific. Ladies first, Jane.
Okay, well, I don't have any wonderful slides for you. I'm Jane Williams, the Executive Director of California Communities Against Toxics. I'm also the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to the Air Resources Board on its greenhouse gas reduction plans. So I have to admit I have been very busy defending the Clean Air Act from a rapacious Congress, so I have not focused 100% of my attention on what is going on at the state level on this. So a quick inquiry, and I wanted to know, so what's happening? What's actually happening on the ground in California with fuels? Here's some interesting things. Brazil is spending a huge amount of money to build a nuclear submarine fleet. They are doing that so they can protect their newfound oil fields off their coast. The search for new oil and gas fields, which the oil and gas industry has been engaging in for the last decade, has hit pay dirt with major large new discoveries of oil and gas in North America. California is still one of the largest purchasers of transportation fuels globally. I know we say we're the state of California, but we consume transportation fuels more like a country, not a state. The tar sands project, which will be one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases and environmental destruction approved probably in this century. A couple quick statistics, since it's been quite a bit in the news and will be more in the news because of a lot of actions and civil disobedience and people besieging the Obama administration not to approve the Keystone Pipeline project. The project will cause as much greenhouse gas emissions per day as running 1.3 million cars. It will emit 36 million tons of carbon dioxide a day. It will use more water than a city of 2 million people. It will use more than 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas. And it will leak 11 million liters of toxic water into the groundwater and the land-based water in Canada's one of Canada's most pristine boreal forests. California itself today continues to permit the expansion of the oil and gas extraction industry. In the city of Los Angeles, we are facing a massive expansion of the extraction of oil and gas. Also, I received in my email today that the Central Valley Health Policy Institute released a report last Wednesday. It found asthma-related emergency room visits rise as PM 2.5 rises, even on days with moderately dirty air, meaning when you walk in the Capitol and you see the things on yellow, people are still going to the emergency room. And those asthma-related visits climb in lockstep with increased pollution, PM 2.5. Plans to reduce California's PM 2.5 under the Federal Clean Air Act are all overdue and none are yet in force. California uses a lot of ethanol, a lot. 2 years ago, the corn crop in the United States, less than 10% went to produce ethanol. This year, in 2011, 40% of the corn in the United States is used to produce ethanol. I emailed a report into the record. It should be in your packet. I have to say I got it by surreptitious means. It's a opinion of the Scientific Committee on Greenhouse Gas Accounting in relation to bioenergy, essentially from the EU Science Advisory Board. And this has to do a lot with Ms. Holmes-Chan's talk about indirect land use. It finds that the accounting by which biomass and bioethanol and bioenergy was accounted for, basically saying that it's a zero, sort of a wash on carbon, was a horrible accounting error. And now that global food prices have risen inexorbitantly, actually, you may think that the Libyans got tired of Gaddafi, but what they really got tired of was not having food. What you see happening in Libya is directly related to the biofuels mandates of the European Union. And so the advisors to the European Union are saying that G20 governments should remove provisions of current national policies that subsidize biofuel production and consumption because of the impact of food price rises on the poor. About 300 million more people are now hungry because of EU and US biofuel mandates. about 1/3 of a billion people. The International Monetary Fund report in 2008 says that biofuels account for 1.5% of global liquid fuels, which is a very small percent. But it represents 1/2 of the increase in food crop prices. When I saw one of the slides up here, I noted down sustainable biofuels. And I'm not sure what that is. I have worked on biofuels and looked at biofuels, and I don't know what a sustainable biofuel would look like at this point. But it's certainly not in existence yet, okay? I wanted to close by saying that, as you know, the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to the Air Resources Board on greenhouse gas policy did not recommend the low carbon fuel standard become an early action measure. We submitted copious comments into the record, stating that we were extremely concerned about the impact that a biofuels mandate would have on the poor. In California, it was at that time 1 in 5 children were being raised at the poverty level. I met with our Department of Education in September, and our testimony directly to the California Air Resources Board talked about biofuels mandates spurring food prices and pushing more children into poverty. Now 1 in 3 California children are growing up in poverty. That's not totally due to biofuels, of course, but there is certainly a huge impact in California from biofuels mandates. The environmental justice movement is a small voice amongst the political voices on this issue. We tried to be a very strong voice. We were ignored. So I'm going to close my comments to you with 2 pieces of information. The head of the World Bank last month said that we need food first, then fuel. We are headed toward a global political and food crisis. We must have food first and then fuel. California has a huge part in this global economy. It is not a state. It behaves like a country. So, and the second thing that I want to end with is my niece, Holly. She is on a flag team. Now, I never knew what these were because when I went to high school, we didn't have them. But it's a dancing with flags, and they dance with the band, and it's a wonderful thing. And so she invited me to one of these performances, and so I sat and I watched 15 flag teams from all over, different parts of California perform. And the thing that struck me was these beautiful young women, all of them having to maintain a very good grade average to maintain their participation in this. And every single team had at least 2 girls that had to walk out onto the gymnasium floor and set their inhalers down. They could not get through a 3-minute performance of their flag team without having to take their inhaler. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Senator DeSaulnier, you are in very good company, being the chairman of the Transportation Committee in the Senate, and you are very uniquely qualified. And as you can see from my testimony, we have huge policy decisions in front of us, and our decisions are having an enormous global reach. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
We appreciate your testimony, and we appreciate, as the world changes, that's the purpose of this panel, is the consequences and the impacts on new fuels. So I appreciate that. David?
Good afternoon. Thank you for your comments. Thank you also, Senator, for inviting me. And how much time do I have? One of your assistants there knows. She was very specific.
I think we were 5 minutes, but
5 minutes.
You've waited a long time.
If I go over that, you start waving your hands, okay? I don't think I will. Although recently when BlackBerry crashed was the same day I spilled my coffee on my laptop, so I actually went back old school and I kind of stuck here for a while. Paper.
And the world went on.
Yeah. But the United Steelworkers, first off, I represent a local of steelworkers in Southern California. We have 2,200 oil workers, either refinery workers or production workers in our local. And then also we have solar cell manufacturers, and recently we have organized and got a first contract in the ethanol terminal there in Los Angeles. Despite our the industry for our local, our international has been a strong supporter of AB 32, even though we've been concerned all along about the issue of carbon leakage and therefore, as we view it, job leakage. But I personally have been involved with environmental justice organizations, and our locals affiliated with Californians for Healthy and Green Economy, and so on and so forth. One of my mentors was Tony Mazzocchi, who years and years ago in the old chemical atomic workers talked about cradle to grave for toxins. So I understand that concept. You know, one of the people who buys the goods from my local, he keeps buying styrofoam cups, and I keep getting angry at him. But he doesn't take into account how much it costs the public to dispose of these damn styrofoam cups.
The former chair of this committee had a bill to that effect this year, but he may run it again.
Okay. But what brings me here is that while we support AB 32, we would urge our legislators to be very careful about how this is all implemented. For example, the largest, most modern refinery in the world, it started construction in 1999, is now online. It makes 1.2 million barrels per day of finished product, and it's on the Nelson scale, the complex that makes or can make 600,000 barrels a day of California Air Sources poured gasoline is rated 14 on the Nelson scale, which makes it one of the most advanced refineries in the world. And one thing that some folks don't realize is that refineries are designed to run particular types of crude. You can't run a heavy crude through a refinery or heavier crude through a refinery or a sour crude unless you have specialized equipment and capacity. So the refineries we have in California are designed to run specific, what we call crude slates. The other trend in the industry, of course, is that when oil prices are high, like they are now, and demand is shrinking in the United States, the margins on refining, the profits for the company remain high because they make most of the profits in exploration production. The margins on refining are low, relatively low. And just like any other business person, companies are going to make their investments where they get a greater return on that investment. If you own a chain of grocery stores and one of them's not doing too well, not making too much money, you're going to shut it down and put up a grocery store somewhere else. And the point that you made, Senator, earlier about these refinery jobs, statewide, the steel workers represent workers in 10 refineries. We make the majority of the fuel, for, gasoline for the state of California, jet fuel, and so on and so forth. But we do carry, the manufacturing jobs as a whole carry a number of service sector jobs, and our jobs are fairly well paid. Not as much as we'd like to in the next contract, but but they're fairly well paid, and the primary goal of our union, at least in the oil industry, is never been about the pay. It's more been about the safety. Be that as it may, the industry trend is to split off refining. And we see this in a number of companies like Valero and Tesoro, who are only refiners. They're not vertically integrated oil companies. And those refineries buy crude on the spot market. They sell it on the spot market. So while I've been in favor, for a number of years, I've shown a movie in my local called, or a video called The End of Suburbia, and it's about peak oil and its profound impact on society, peak oil meaning world production. And at the same time, I've talked to workers about the need for what we call the just transition for workers in their communities. By that, we mean there needs to be a transition for workers in the dirty, unsustainable industries to the clean, sustainable industries. Off the top of my head, I can think of one industry that I believe was going to have to come online in California within the next 20 years is desalinization. As climate change takes effect in North America, I don't think we're going to have any choice but to start to look for desalinized water. Both the wet process and the dry process for solar, converting solar to electricity, both take, one takes a lot of natural gas, one takes a lot of water. And driving up the San Joaquin Valley, we see farmers in the food basket of the nation who are desperate for water. So it seems to me it makes a lot of sense to have a plan. If there are going to be workers displaced, there should be a planned conversion of the workers and their communities to the new, clean, sustainable economy. Thank you.
I'll take it. Mr. Epstein, last but not least.
Thank you very much. Michelle gave me 5 minutes. I'll tend to leave some time left over for questions. So you have in front of you the testimony that I submitted. I just want to draw your attention to one chart that I'll be talking about, which is on the first page there. So one of the things I did as a member of the review panel for the low carbon fuel standard this year, so we wanted to figure out just how much advanced biofuels activity was there in the marketplace. We defined advanced biofuels to have to be at least 75% lower greenhouse gases than gasoline or diesel, no use of food, and sustainably managed, and I'll defer to Jane to discuss the specifics, but we focus primarily on waste materials and non-food agriculture. The question was, well, if a company's going to deliver by 2015, they must already exist, so how many are out there that can deliver, and what's their current status, and what's their investment? And you have there the chart that shows there's, we identified 240 companies, we eliminated ones we didn't think were viable, that are producing fuel that in 2011 will produce 437 million gallons of very low carbon advanced biofuels. If you just take those companies and you research their projections, now, companies don't always make their projections, so this is not a forecast. It's a sum of projections. It's about 3.2 billion gallons. So my question on that is, how much of that fuel will actually be produced, and will it show up to California? Because this would go a long ways. If a percentage of this got produced and come to California, it would go a long ways toward meeting demand. I want to draw attention to one thing. Of that, cellulosic ethanol is less than 15%. So you could just make that zero if you don't believe any will happen. It's still a lot of fuel. The real drivers on these in the short term are non-soy biodiesel, typically made from waste products. And then it starts to look in the renewable diesel, renewable gasoline, biocrude, things that can drop directly into existing refineries and operations. So if we look at what it will take to make that happen from those, and the companies are listed in the full report, so you can look at every single company. It isn't that many. You could just say, how are they doing? Quarter by quarter, whatever. Are they really going to deliver? Are they attracted to California? And we identified four areas in policy that we thought were really important. They're described on page 3. I'm just going to skip right ahead. Number 1 is to maintain the LCFS targets, because that and the renewable fuel standard is what's driving That and high gasoline prices is what's driving the investment in all of these companies to do it. So maintaining the targets provide assurance that there will be a market in California. The second is the Air Board is working on this to find an alternative compliance mechanism for the cases where a company can't meet the target for whatever number. We want to make sure that doesn't undermine the value of the companies that do make it. The 3 and 4 are the most critical ones. Right now, if you're a company, you can't really take that carbon benefit and convert it into money. So we would like to see an expanded LCFS trading system, and we're working on a proposal that we're submitting to CARB on how that could be accomplished next year. We've seen that work with the RFS too. Companies will take their risk capital, will go into the market, they'll have lower carbon, they'll convert that into money, invest it back in. So that quick cycle is what's going to drive the industry. And then in our research, we were intrigued by a project set up in the state of Hawaii, who has a very aggressive renewables target. In Hawaii, all of their electricity is made from diesel, so they have an acute problem. They put together a fuel purchase program where they asked for RFPs. They got 10 different consortiums submitting proposals on how they would convert Hawaiian biomass to renewable diesel that could plug into the systems that are already there. They awarded 2 contracts already. Those contracts are described on that last page that generated about $500 million in capital activity in the state of Hawaii just from those contracts. I would argue there's a way to take the public fleet purchases, whether you look at universities, cities, schools, the state fleet, and take some amount of that, and for the entities that want to participate, put out some RFPs. You'll be surprised pleasantly at what the responses will be. It requires some amount of California content, and if we could get, let's say, 100 million gallons of ultra-low carbon fuel made out of waste material in California, that's going to go a material way to solving the problem that Kathy identified in her chart of how we're going to get this done. So in summary, there is enough market activity now that certain categories of advanced biofuels no longer have a technology risk, they have a financing risk for financing their facilities. California is an attractive place because of the LCFS, the RFS 2 credit. If we expand the credit program in California, attract them, and create some competitive fuel purchase programs, I think we can make California be to biofuels, well done properly, the same as what we are to solar. 1 in 4 solar jobs are in California, I believe is the number. We became the capital of it. We should do that in fuels, and those fuels, certain types can go into current refineries, certain types will compete with refineries. All I know is that in the Fortune 500, every 10 years there's a 50% turnover. It's not the job of state government to stop innovation or company competition. Our goal should be to encourage the maximum amount of competition done with safe fuels that can really drive us to our climate goals and cleaner air. Thank you.
Bob, nicely done. Well, I want to thank all of you on this panel as well. Similarly to the last panel, I just want to make sure that people realize we're not trying to do things in the Transportation Committee that rightly is under the purview of the Energy Committee of the State Senate. But obviously there is a relationship, so we're going to continue to have this discussion. And to the degree that you have thoughts in that regard, and I particularly sort of like when we go into the next legislative session, all of you will pursue legislative agendas of your own, some form or fashion with different members. But for the committee, the hope is, at least on my part, is to work with committee members to come up with at least some overall framework that we want to look at in relationship to how we provide infrastructure for transportation, and where there's an appropriate role, particularly around 375 and housing, where we have a relationship. And then continue the discussion with Senator Padilla and his committee of where our jurisdictions cross, where we can do things. So that's the point of this hearing, really, in my mind's eye, and to make sure that, in addition to making sure that the legislature continues to have understanding of what's happening in all of your fields, not just when it comes to legislation that comes through these houses, and also what our regulatory agencies are doing, particularly CARB in this instance, but also the Energy Commission, the PUC. So I really don't have any questions. Partially is because we're so overdone, and I know that we have members of the public who would like to speak. So I just want to thank you all. I very much appreciate you sitting through the whole hearing and the discussion. If you have further thoughts, we would like to continue the discussion, given that it's the end of October and we're sort of looking into going into January and February in the legislative cycle with a little more information for the committee's guidance as we go through the next session. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, members of the public, if you'd like to just come forward, you can have a seat up here and address what's left to the committee. Is there anyone other than Gene Urban who would like to speak? You are a panel of one.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, Senator. I know you're probably exhausted.
Now we save the best for last, Mr. Urban.
I represent the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, the members of which are all dedicated to using all the fuels you discussed today. I know mentioning the CAFE standard is probably considered antiquated and old-fashioned, but it's not. The only way you get to 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025 is by using all these fuels. So it's integrated into that. So I don't think CAFE should be neglected next time, and that's my word. I think it's been neglected, or it's now been dismissed as having been accomplished. Okay. It will be accomplished, but it hasn't been accomplished yet.
I can tell you this. That was a federal mandate, Mr. Urban. We're preempted from...
Both state and federal, I would suggest. It's kind of synchronized now. I would also suggest to you, again, this will be disappointing, that I think it's going to be improvements in the ICE, the internal combustion engine, and related stuff like lighter materials, transmissions, tires, that get us the near and incremental improvements, intermediate improvements. There's all sorts of fascinating stuff, including like 3-cylinder vehicles, but it's mostly, I think, going to be improvements to the internal combustion engine. You asked a lot of questions about AB 118. No one spent more time or dedicated more resources in the Alliance to enactment of AB 118. It's succeeded. It's also failed. I can tell you privately some examples where it has not succeeded. You also mentioned public goods charge. This year, this is an example of sort of the schizophrenia or dishonesty of the policies around here. We promoted a provision of the public goods charge that would have taken $10 million a year and given it to the AB 118 rebate program, which initially offered $5,000 per preferred vehicle, reduced it to $2,500 because you're out of money. That got no interest. Democrats didn't like that. So we have a policy and a program to subsidize the purchase of all the vehicles that were discussed today, but there was no interest in providing additional money, although the demand is clearly demonstrated. So that was a disappointment to us. We hope to renew that. Two more items. One, we hate fee-bates. They are, it's really bad policy. They're regressive, classist, and undemocratic. But other than that, we have no objection.
This is bringing back memories of you and Assemblymember Ruskin.
Correct. Correct. We don't dislike them. We hate them. And then lastly, fascinating discussion about fuels of the future. What about the roads, highways, bridges of the future? Who's going to pay for all of this? Who's going to finance the transportation infrastructure, particularly as miles per gallon go to 54.5 by 2025? And I don't mean the refueling infrastructure. That's important, but that is a tiny component of what we're talking about. The Transportation Commission released its report last week. $550 billion in the next 10 years, 350 of which is just maintenance and preservation, 350 billion of which is maintenance and preservation. So we need a serious effort on transportation infrastructure financing. None of those fuels pay a hell of a lot. Gasoline and diesel still pays, but its use is declining, and that rate of descent is going to accelerate. You know this, we've talked about it, but we need to start engaging. We can't just promote the use of these fuels without somehow financing the roads upon which they're driven. Thanks.
Now, Gene, I'd like to have that discussion because I brought that up a little bit in the first panel, and it's my hope that have a further discussion about how do we fund all of this in a world that changes. I remember some years ago when Germany was talking about putting a meter on all their trucks and charging a VMT when they first started talking about that. So clearly the current model is not going to be the model of the future either. So part of this was to talk about the fuels of the future, but also is in the future to talk about how we fund a infrastructure that's going to be very different, or at least the product that on there.
We have some good and relatively novel ideas that might actually pass some political sort of.
But they won't involve fees or rebates for SUVs.
They could.
They could.
They're not going to be fee baits. That has nothing to do with transportation infrastructure, as you know. It's all internal. You know, you extract money from people who buy big cars to give it to people who buy small cars. Basically.
Granted. But if we don't provide the infrastructure for your constituents' product, then it won't work for them either.
No one's going to buy any vehicle if we don't have the infrastructure upon which they can be driven.
Right. Other folks here for public comment? Thank you for waiting patiently.
Thanks for having me. I'm Keith Bynes, and I work out of Rodale Refinery, local 326. I have a kind of a statement, and then I have a concern. The statement is I work at the water treatment plant in Rodale, and we discharge to the San Francisco Bay. So I understand the environmental impact on a lot of things. And I know we're held to a higher standard. We want to go home safe, and we want everything, the environment, everything else to be safe. My statement is on the East Coast, we have unions out there with refineries. There's 3 that will be or trying to be sold. There's 1 that's been shut down for a year. Those are union jobs and community restaurants, stores, and all that thing that will be affected. And my concern is in California with the same thing, how we would be affected there. If there were fewer refineries left to provide California's fuels that they need, California would be forced to rely more on foreign imports, which on the East Coast, a lot of stuff is coming from outside the United States and affecting the workers out there. Basically, that's my statement. I'm concerned about my workers, my community in Rodale and around Rodale, the schools, and the infrastructure and everything else. That's my statement. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Mike Miller. I'm the president of the United Steelworkers, Local 326 out of Rodale, California. I've been working in the refinery and the refinery industry for approximately 25 years. This refinery has been producing clean fuel products for Californians for 75 years. Mr. DeSalia, you had mentioned a multiplier of 14 at the beginning of this hearing. I represent, like I said, 300 workers at the Rodale refinery. And the other businesses that are affected by what we do, you multiply by 14, you're talking of 4,200. If we went to 50% of the refineries in your district in Contra Costa County, what's that come out to? 7,000 households, which incomes could be affected. I want to thank you for conducting this hearing. You know, you say this is the future of fuels in California. I have a little different outlook that I feel it could be the future of jobs in California. If we start running these refineries out of the state of California, it's going to be imports just like what's happening to our union brothers and sisters in Pennsylvania. We ask that you please be creative with how we roll this out and implement this program to give these companies the opportunity to get into compliance. This job has been a game changer for me, my family, my people I represent and their family. A lot of us have been able to attain the American dream to become homeowners. we ask that you please take into consideration the jobs that this could affect. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate you coming up and your testimony. And I will mention, I spent 4 terms on the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors and in the Air District and in the Bay Area. And when I was there, and you were in the unincorporated area of the county, we passed the Industrial Safety Ordinance with the help of OCAW in those days, and I never called it OCA. And that turned out to be, it was a very tough ordinance to put together, but it's now been 10 years, and regularly in the newspaper on its anniversary, there's a story about how successful it's been protecting your safety. But I'd add literally hundreds of millions of infrastructure's gone into those the 3 refineries in the unincorporated area and the one in the city of Richmond that followed that ordinance. So we can do regulatory oversight in partnership with the regulated community, with you folks, to provide more safety and good jobs, but we have to be sensitive to your comments as well and make sure you stay there. And we did the refinery flare rule that affected at the Air District, so it can be done, but as you say, we have to be very sensitive and not drive out the business, and we'll continue to try to do that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else under public comment? Well, we want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. This was scheduled to be done at 3:30, and I hope a reflection of the chair not getting things done on time, but we had a really good discussion. I want to thank our staff, our excellent staff, and former staff. I also want to thank my colleagues for joining and being involved, and for all of the people who testified. We hope to follow up and have, as I say, more discussion with our other committees. I would like to mention that we had a lot of discussion, too, about air quality today, and don't want to take away from the purview and jurisdiction of Senator Simitian's committee, the Environmental Quality Committee. But to the degree that this committee, Transportation and Housing, can work more with you and where we have an appropriate role, and I particularly think Mr. Urban's comment at the end, as we struggle for ways to figure out how to provide infrastructure and what that financing is going to be, we particularly need your input. So thank you for your time, and we are adjourned.